to accept it. With that said, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. Rick Magill earned his master's degree from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy in 2013. While in school, Rick worked at START on the Global Terrorism Database and on special projects research. He later worked as a contractor in a variety of jobs, most notably with the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the U.S. Secret Service. Rick, you can go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. So a couple of things. First off, I've been working from home since March, so this is the first shirt with a collar I think I've worn since March. So you should feel pretty privileged, pretty special. I put on a college shirt for everybody. So this presentation is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of some research and, based on work, research, and observations and things like that. So this is kind of my personal presentation. Any opinions or anything like that are not my employer or the Secret Service, who's I'm currently supporting on a contract. So I just have to give that little CYA statement first. And so just so nothing can go back to them. This is my presentation individually. So I'm going to be talking about terrorist financing, which is an easy to define. And you often hear, politicians and officials say the key to stopping terrorists is stopping the financing. Well, what does that actually mean? That sounds good, but you're not just going to go to banks and close Al-Qaeda's bank account. It's not that simple. So there's a lot more that goes into it than would appears on the surface. So there's multiple definitions of terrorist financing, but they're all pretty simple. But the one that I found is from ACAMS, which is the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. And they define it, I have to consult some notes here, the process by which terrorists fund their operations in order to perform terrorist acts. Okay, that's simple enough. It's getting money to do terrorist stuff. But what does that actually mean, right? Because when you think of terrorists and terrorist financing, there's a variety of potential actors that you have. Small groups, you have huge groups, you have individuals looking to perpetrate acts, and you have groups looking to get tons of people to perpetrate acts or do a large scale attack or something like that. And then you also have groups like ISIS tried to do until relatively recently, who are trying to run a state, and that requires different funding streams and different money laundering mechanisms than they're going to be for small groups or individuals or things like that. So an effective program, an effective CTF, counter threat finance program, really has to understand what are these terrorist acts? What are they looking to do with the money? How much money are they looking to get? Because you have to know where to look, because you can't just look in the same place for everyone. And different groups are going to have different techniques and different ways to generate funds depending on their resources, depending on what they're comfortable with, and all sorts of different factors. And this presentation, I tried to keep it to about 45, 50 minutes. It's not going to hit on everything. There's going to be things that I miss and, details that I won't talk about, perhaps some better examples. But, this is just to give a broad overview of terrorist financing, some of the mechanisms used to detect it, and what the future of terrorist financing might look like that we're not seeing right now. So, but there are some general traits, excuse me, that kind of cover the broad spectrum of terrorist financing. These are very broad because each situation is so unique. But funds for terrorist acts can originate from licit or illicit sources. So if you have an individual or small group of individuals looking to do some sort of terrorist act, they can save up for that act using their paychecks, right? If you have a decent paying job, if you don't have a decent paying job, you can save up enough money and be able to fund your attack or what you want to do. There's also remittances. You can get money from family or friends abroad, or gifts from family and friends, things like that. These wouldn't raise any red flags because they're perfectly legitimate streams of finance. Or it can go from illicit sources. Trade in illegal goods is a big one, drugs most specifically, but that can also include antiquities, sex trafficking, stolen goods, ransomware, malware, whatever your illicit good is. You can make a lot of money trading that. There's also theft, fraud, ransoms, and all sorts of other illicit funding mechanisms across the board. I don't think I need to tell everyone what every illicit funding mechanism is, but these acts can be funded either illicitly or illicitly. And expanding upon that, we being places I've worked and researched mostly, but the general community has seen evidence of terrorists using any and all method to obtain and obscure their funds. It includes the things I just talked about, but there's also Al-Shabaab has made a lot of money smuggling charcoal and sugar. These are items you wouldn't think would fund terrorist activity, but Al-Shabaab has used them that way. Or the IRA would solicit donations in the United States at bars and restaurants in the Irish American communities. And they would say it's for the lads or for a charity or something like that. And I think some people there may have knew what it meant, whereas other people might have thought it was a charity. But so it's really across the board. And we've also seen Al-Qaeda use illicit charities. So here you have the IRA and Al-Qaeda, who are, I think on pretty opposite ends of the philosophical spectrum. And they're using similar methods to generate funds. And that leads to the last point, whereas the tactics don't differ significantly between philosophies. So you can't really say, oh, jihadi groups do this, and groups like the IRA do this. It's really more what resources are available to the group and the people looking to perpetrate the attack or generate funds, and what are they comfortable with, and how do they want to use them. So into that, you really have to know your subject. You have to know who you're talking about and who you're looking to stop. So saying empty statements like we're going to stop funding terrorists. Well, who you stop and how do you go about doing that? And the different methods to go about doing that vary greatly on the subject as to their tactics. So, because individuals will have different goals and methods than these large scale organizations. So individuals may conduct transactions that don't really make any financial sense. First, they may go thousands of dollars into credit card debt. They may do all sorts of different things that don't really make any sense, because if they're planning on perpetrating an attack, they might not plan on making it out with that attack, either alive or not incarcerated. So, and the funding and laundering methods will vary by group, depending on their resources, what's available. And so you have to recognize your subject and what they're trying to do, what they're looking to do, what their plan is, what type of subject are you dealing with. And this partially is, the general US counter-threat finance development methodology program is based largely on Al-Qaeda, because it was developed. There was a professor, I can't remember his name, but he's at Notre Dame. I went to a webinar where he was speaking, and he helped develop the counter-threat finance program after 9/11, because a lot of this was developed after 9/11. And so, things like the Patriot Act and all sorts of other banking acts and things like that. And it's designed around Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda was, obviously a pretty large organization with global outreach, as we unfortunately all saw. But Al-Qaeda was also largely externally funded. So they relied on, donations were a big part of their funding, but also money coming in from outside. They weren't generating much of their own revenue. They were generating some, but the lion's share of their revenue came from outside of the group. Whereas then you have groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS, most know that. You're going to hear me reference ISIS and Al-Shabaab a lot, just because there's been so much research done on these groups, but they're far from the only ones. And they're generating their own revenue. So they're, establishing their own drug trades. They're establishing their own sex trades and whatever it may be. They're generating their own money. And so they're not reliant on that money, as reliant on that money coming in from outside. They'll take it, and they certainly do get money coming in from the outside. But it's not the core part of their funding system. So we had to adjust our approach to how we're going to stop their funding versus Al-Qaeda's funding, because they're very different. They may have similar philosophies, again, but very different, because their resources, their availability, and things they can do are very different. So going into knowing your subject, the costs, you have to consider the cost of terrorism. Running a state and conducting attacks on a large scale, like ISIS tried to do, is very expensive. So because a lot of ISIS's money went to things other than terrorism, right? Because they were trying to run a state. So they ran a lot of services for the people living in their quote unquote caliphate. I had to show the air quotes there because it's ISIS. And so they ran several services. That includes taxes and tax collection. They ran their own DMV. They had garbage pickup. They issued birth certificates. They did all sorts of administrative tasks, really. But they also had to pay the people doing these tasks. You have to pay them somehow. And a lot of people, but ISIS knew that a lot of people might be more receptive to them if they were able to provide these services better than the Syrian government could. And in a lot of cases they did. So people living in these territories were more willing to put up with them because, well, at least they pave the roads, at least they pick up the garbage, at least they do these basic tasks that the Syrian government wasn't even doing at the time, and probably still isn't. And so that won them a lot of support, but that's a large investment. So that takes a lot of money. So you do things like sell oil and antiquities, which I'll get into in a little bit, and some of the numbers that they were generating at their peak. So that's expensive. But individual acts of terrorism, you see from lone wolves or very small groups, they can be very cheap. The one that pops to mind is the truck attack in Nice, where I think it was 2 or 3 individuals rented a truck and ran it down the boulevard. That killed 86 people at, relatively no cost. I did a quick search on budget rental car to how much it would cost to rent a moving truck in College Park, where, then it was 8 or 10 miles to downtown DC, if that. I could get a 26-foot truck for $40 plus $1.29 a mile. So that might be another $10. So the whole thing could cost $50. So something like that can easily be funded with a paycheck. You can work pretty much anywhere and fund that with a paycheck. So you have to, so if you're looking to stop terrorist financing from either government point of view, private sector point of view, and I'll get into some of the other industries that you might not think of that would need to be involved in terrorist financing for it to be effective, in CTF, I should say, counter threat finance. For it to be effective, you need to know what your subjects are doing and what they're looking to do and why they're looking to do it. So, because these funding methods and techniques, they'll inevitably be different across the board. So some methods that we see, especially on the large organization side, they're similar to organized crime. A lot of these things, drug trade, all these things I've said so far, utilizing front companies, illicit trade, forging connections. This is all stuff that we have seen the mafia do. This is all stuff that street gangs do. This is, you name it. It's really the same techniques to generate money, and the difference is what you want to use that money for. So, to go a little bit more in depth on each one, front companies are huge. They are very important. ISIS, have several front companies that were in the Turkish border region, specifically in the Gaziantep area. So, they would open a company, claims to be involved in the textile trade or something like that. That money comes into that Turkish company, and then they get the funds right over the border into Syria, where they then can go to fund ISIS activity. So, but they had to establish somewhat of a presence in Turkey because there's little to no banking presence in Syria. And companies and individuals and banks will be much less likely to report transactions to Turkey, because Turkey, at least in 2015, was considered a much safer location than certainly Syria. If you're wiring money directly to Syria, that's going to get picked up in a heartbeat, and those funds will never get transferred. But to Turkey, for business, they might let that go, and then that company can work to get that money into Syria. But front companies have been used, I mean, since the beginning of the 20th century. The mob was big on front companies. Any decent organized criminal organization would know about front companies and how to work them. But, you know, in illicit trade is huge, especially the drug trade. You know, in human smuggling, human trade, and things like that, because that generates a lot of money. And these groups will forge connections with groups in other locations of businesses. So Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has made a lot of money trafficking cocaine to Europe. But they get that cocaine from cartels and organizations in South America. So they act as that middleman to get the drugs into Europe. Now, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and some drug cartel in South America have, I'm going to guess, very different worldviews and philosophies on how things should operate. And I mean, they're different religions, different in everything, but they're working together for this area of common interest. And we've seen organized crime do the same thing. So they're not afraid to do business across ideological lines at all, as long as it makes them money and will advance what they want to advance. And we've also seen some terrorist organizations start to ingratiate themselves in governments and in disparate parts of the world. So I believe he's the vice president. I meant to look up his official title. Tarek El-Aissami, he's a higher up, let's say, in the Venezuelan government. And he's been indicted by the United States for drug trafficking, supporting terrorist organizations. I mean, you name it, this guy's been indicted for it. And he's Lebanese, and he has very clear ties to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is starting to create a presence in Venezuela. Not starting, they have created a presence in Venezuela. So there's, you know, and again, what would they have? Their boys, their usually boys in the city, state, local, who will let them go, do whatever they want. So they're starting to do some similar things, trying to work into official bureaucracy, official.
Hi, Rick. We might be having some technical difficulties. Can you hear me?
Detection really requires an across-the-board effort. We tend to think of it as a government problem, a government or a law enforcement problem, but it's really also a private sector and other institution type problem. So governments and law enforcement are going to play a huge role largely in setting policies and things like that. But financial institutions are really the frontline detectors of this. And there's also options, other things, finance, organ, and government. And
all right. I believe we are now recording, and so I can hand things back over to you, Rick. Again, sorry for that interruption, and thank you for your patience, everyone.
No problem. Stuff happens, right? In this COVID world, relying on Zoom and things like that, stuff happens. So where was I? Oh yeah, the currency transaction report. That's any transaction that you as an individual, cash transaction, do that's over $10,000. So if you deposit $10,000 cash to a bank, that automatically gets reported, or withdraw $10,000 cash, that will get reported. That's not illegal. If you've done that, it's not illegal. It's perfectly fine. But it can, you know, add a little bit of evidence. Maybe if like you have wind that a person's involved in drug trafficking, and you see they're doing a bunch of cash transactions over $10,000, that can raise some red flags. but that gets automatically reported. But it's, nothing to worry about. But Form 8300, that's the cash transactions with a business. So if you buy a car in $20,000 cash, that gets reported. Now it's not just cash. It's really anything without financing. So if you buy a house in cash, in cash, it just means you don't finance it, then that will get reported, right? CMIR, currency or monetary instrument report. That's if you bring $10,000 worth of monetary instruments into the country from abroad via boat. If you walk in, if you drive in, that will get reported. Again, not necessarily illegal, but can add some evidence to what you're doing, to your investigation or whatever. RMSB, that's registration of money services businesses. So every MSB has to be registered with the U.S. Treasury Department, and this is their registration. So it is illegal to operate an unlicensed money services business. So they need to have that to show that they're registered. And then designation of exempt party, that's probably the one that I've used least. That's just businesses that will do a lot of cash transactions. So they don't need to continually file currency transaction reports or CTR. So Walmart, Target, places like that, or DOEPs, because otherwise they'd have a million of these cash forms that they really don't, that really are useless to pretty much everyone. So financial institutions, as I said, they have access to real-time data, real-time transaction information, and customer information. And that's very important. It can add a lot to investigation. And investigation or just your background info or who you're looking into or whatever. Most of the time you might, to get really in-depth information, you have to subpoena the bank. But they have access to this information, and that can add a lot. And that adds an element that government entities alone really probably don't have access to. So they really have to work in concert for an effective counter-threat finance program to work. And correspondent banking. So correspondent banking, that makes avoiding the U.S. banking system very difficult. I'll get into that in a second, but correspondent banking. So correspondent bank is a bank that provides services on behalf of another financial institution. And it's usually smaller financial institutions will partner with larger banks to get access to greater services, to expand their potential abilities. They might be able to get greater loan rates that way or something like that. It helps to partner with a big bank if you're a small bank. So I'll show you in a minute how correspondent banking can play a role where the two parties sending money to each other might not really realize that. So first, basic path of a wire transfer, right? So I'm over on the right with Wells Fargo. I'm getting money from The Rock, Dwayne Johnson. Young people probably know him as Dwayne Johnson now. He's loaded, so he's going to send me a lot of money because I'm not. And so he banks with Bank of America, right? And I bank with Wells Fargo, two huge banks that do a ton of business with each other. So they clearly will have accounts with each other because they're transferring money between each other all the time. So that money will go from The Rock's personal account to Bank of America's account with Wells Fargo, get sent over to Wells Fargo's account, and then with the SWIFT or CHIPS or FedWire information, those are bank communication systems that provide specific instructions for what to do with that money and which account to credit it to. And then that will come into my account. No problem, because they're huge. They do business all the time. That can happen very quickly. All right, where it gets a little more complicated is with the correspondent banking is when you have two really small banks. So I'm over on the left, I'm banking in Mongolia. The small Mongolian bank only does business on the steppe. And I want to send money to the Iron Sheik. The Iron Sheik, those who don't know, was a wrestler back in the 80s. So I assume he's broke now. And he's in Azerbaijan, right? Two small countries, not small territorial countries, but two small countries in terms of having access to large banking systems. And I want to send him money. Who knows what it's for? But now, so I might think if let's say this is an illicit transaction, this is for something bad. And I'm thinking, well, I'm in Mongolia. he's in Azerbaijan. No way that the U.S. government, who wants me for some, for a crime or something, is ever going to find that. There's no way they'll find that. Well, that's not the case, because the small Mongolian bank and the small Azerbaijani bank, they don't have accounts with each other. They don't do business together because they have no need to, because they only focus on their local areas. They don't do much international stuff. So they don't really need to worry about that. So I have to find a way to get, the bank has to find a way to get that money from my Mongolian account to his Azerbaijani account. So my Mongolian bank, they have a partnership with Standard Chartered, a correspondent partnership with Standard Chartered, a huge multinational bank. But Iron Sheik's bank does not have a partnership with Standard Chartered. So Standard Chartered can't send directly to this Azerbaijani bank. But the Iron Sheik's bank has a partnership with Barclays, another huge bank. So the funds can go from my Mongolian bank to Standard Chartered's correspondent account, to Standard Chartered's correspondent account with Barclays, from Barclays' correspondent account with the Azerbaijani bank to the Iron Sheik's bank account. Now, it can get intercepted or reported at that top level, at that top row, by U.S. financial authorities, because it can get reported because Standard Chartered and Barclays both have a presence in the United States, because they want access to the United States markets, because they want access to Wall Street and all, Amazon and Apple and all the big, huge companies that are headquartered here. So it's going to be in that top row that can get reported to U.S. government authorities. Whereas me and Mongolia and the Iron Sheik and Azerbaijan would never think that could get reported. So let's say instead, let's say I know that, and I want to avoid the banking system entirely. So I say, let me just wire it to you through a money services business. Through I'll go to this little convenience store where you can wire money, and you go to your convenience store and pick it up. Well, that's similarly problematic, because Western Union is one of the largest providers of these wire transfer services in the world. They have over 500,000 agent locations, 200 plus countries and territories. In 2018, they conducted 800 million transactions. MoneyGram is also another big one. They have 350,000 agent locations. So worldwide, that's 850,000 agent locations that have a direct tie to the United States because they're headquartered here. So Western Union and MoneyGram have to report all of their suspicious transactions to U.S. authorities. So that makes it hard to avoid even using an MSB like that. So if I were a terrorist financier, you have to try to find another way, because the U.S. government is all over it, basically, and foreign governments as well. The UK we share a lot with the UK. The UK certainly has significant influence at Barclays and Standard Chartered, since they're UK-based banks. Other countries as well have similar systems, but I'm speaking purely of the U.S. system because it's what I know. Whereas the other countries' systems, I don't want to tackle them too much, but I know that they have similar processes that they can gain information. So let's get into a few examples. These were just, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but some large organizations, some of the methods that we've seen include donations, charity fraud, drugs, trade illicit goods, TBML, trade-based money laundering. It's when you have a company either that claims to be involved in a trade and is really just moving illicit funds and doesn't actually do any business in that trade, or the company may actually do some business in that trade, but they commingle illicit funds with their licit funds and then cook the books to make them add up. So there's kind of two ways to look at trade-based money laundering, but they can be legitimate companies that just will commingle their illicit funds and then you cook the books to make everything look right. And reliance on offshore havens and shell companies. Offshore havens, those who don't know, those are companies that you can, usually shell companies, front companies that don't actually do any business, that are headquartered in the Virgin Islands, Grand Cayman, places like that, where they have very strict secrecy laws. So it's very hard for anyone to find out who actually owns that company, who registered it, who's affiliated to it. They have very high secrecy standards. They also have very low taxes, or none. So a lot of companies will use shell havens for tax avoidance. You gotta be careful with evasion and avoidance. Avoidance is when big companies do it and it's legal. Evasion is when, small people like me do it. But so to get into a couple of examples, ISIS trade in oil and antiquities. ISIS generated approximately $500 million from selling oil and gas in 2015. The oil was usually sold to independent brokers or traders, or was smuggled to be sold elsewhere, usually in Iraq and Syria. These types of transactions would be difficult for a financial institution to pick up. A lot of them were done in cash and in countries with little to no banking presence like Iraq and Syria. So, and then they also generated millions of dollars in smuggling and trading antiquities. So this is where your museums and auction houses come into play in terms of, finding and stopping these illicitly acquired goods. I know a couple museums have gotten in trouble for acquiring black items that were sold on the black market, and they may not have been tied to ISIS, but they were still sold on the black market. And so these institutions, they have to work with government authorities, work with their banks and everything like that to really form a comprehensive, CTF type of program. And similarly, another example I brought up before, AQIM, they're trading in illicit goods. The drug trade has become a huge fundraiser for them in West Africa. They'll work with the Latin American cartels to smuggle drugs, but there's also an increasing amount of drugs that are being made and manufactured in West Africa and smuggled from there. So these would be different, these are probably different groups. These might be local criminal organizations, some small time, groups looking to just make some extra money by manufacturing meth or heroin or whatever. And they're working together with these groups to push their goods, and then they figure out the financials after. So in 2015, there's an estimate that there was $1.25 billion worth of cocaine transited through West Africa and AQIM's estimated revenue was up to $150 million. If anybody wants sources for these things, I do have sources. I just thought it would take up too much space to put them. And AQIM and other groups, they also rely on human smuggling, extortion, ransoms, etc. The classic, quote unquote, methods as well. So some small time examples, lone wolf, small group, you got your donations. Again, that is similar with the large organizations, but some small time scams, selling black market goods, illicit trade, and using illicit funds for goods. So Operation Smokescreen, I'm not sure if you've heard of this. It was a Hezbollah sleeper cell in North Carolina. They raised approximately $8 million from 1996 to 2002, but they were all arrested by the FBI in 2002. But they relied on a lot of small-time scams. So cigarette trafficking, buying cigarettes, getting cigarettes in low-tax areas, taking them to high-tax areas so people can buy them black market and not have to pay the tax. Some credit card fraud, check fraud, loan fraud, identity theft, all these things kind of aggregated together to generate a lot of money for them. But a bank or a government, or a law enforcement, entity, they have limited resources too. So if they see a credit card fraud, okay, they're gonna, they take it seriously. I'm not trying to say they don't take it seriously, but they're also they have bigger fish to fry than some small credit card fraud. If it's for $2,000 or $2,000 check fraud, okay, that's bad. It's good to report it, but are they going to send a task force out to go arrest that person who passed a fraudulent check? No, of course not, because they have bigger things to worry about. So, but all these things put together create, we're funding a Hezbollah sleeper cell. So, like I said before, you really have to know who you're going for, what types of methods they would use, who your subjects are, what they're trying to do, and things like that. And that's much easier said than done. So that's why this whole concept of stopping terrorist financing is really much easier said than done. And crowdsourcing. So we've seen this a lot with far-right organizations. They've turned to crowdsourcing for small donations, often made in cryptocurrency. They've used legitimate funding streams like Indiegogo, GoFundMe, and Kickstarter, and PayPal and Google Pay. One example of that, there's a far-right extremist in the UK who received about £20,000 of Bitcoin donations while he was in jail. So that's a different method that we've seen before. We haven't seen a lot of these large groups do this kind of cryptocurrency crowdsourcing, and the far right has really taken a liking to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, which I'll get to in a few minutes. So with that, I'll admittedly brief overview of what terrorist financing kind of looks like, some of the players involved. I mean, you could do a whole class on the current state of terrorist financing, but 45 minutes. So, with that slight overview of the present, what does the future look like? So, and this is where it gets more into my opinion and my conclusions based on research and things like that. So groups will continue to utilize weaknesses in the financial system that they already know. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. They're going to keep utilizing these weaknesses that they know is working for them and making them money, and until they get patched up. So that was a big thing when the U.S. first created its counter threat finance protocols after 9/11. We had to patch up some of those holes that were being exploited and increase communication and things like that. While any holes that currently exist, you're going to keep using them, and we need to patch those holes, but then they'll figure out other things. It's a little bit like whack-a-mole, but if you can have as few moles as possible, then you have to do that. I think Hawala type networks are going to continue to be prevalent. Those who don't know, Hawalas, that's the term used in the Muslim world, but these types of networks are present all around the world, across cultures and things like that. So Hawalas is kind of a catch-all. But they're informal value transfer systems based largely on trust. So if I want to send someone money, I'll go to the Hawaladar, or the agent. I'll give him the money, and then he gives it to an associate who will then give it to the recipient. It's based on trust. There's no involvement of the banking system. All the records are really kept on internal ledgers. So in order to really know what they're doing, you need those internal ledgers. Those are very hard to get because they're very protective of them, reasonably so. And because they're based on trust, you have to be able to trust that agent will get the money to where you want it to go. So these types of networks, they're completely decentralized from the banking system. So all those potential pitfalls of correspondent banking and things like that, you avoid that entirely, assuming you can trust the agent. And these can be used for bulk cash smuggling, and to move cash from one area to another in bulk, and also to get money to areas where there's little to no banking infrastructure. And that's increasingly important, especially Iraq, Syria, the two prime examples, but there are other areas of the world that don't really have much of a banking structure, and they need to get that money, and that's one way for them to do it. And similarly, I think the terrorists will continue trying to avoid the international banking system due to these detection capabilities and the potential for getting caught. You want to minimize your chances for getting caught. And they may look to exploit some developments in illicit finance. So China is emerging, if not emerged, financial powerhouse. They may develop their own banking systems. I don't know entirely if they have yet, but there may be some developments there that could look to be exploited. And Russia is developing its own SWIFT system. SWIFT, on the abbreviation, is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It's a telecommunication system between banks, so that because those wire transfers get sent in bulk in these huge transactions, they're aggregated, and then the SWIFT information will tell them where to go. So that's based in Belgium, but is used by pretty much the entire world. And the US government has had access to it. We've exploited SWIFT to, try to find illicit transactions. But Russia is creating their own SWIFT system for their banks, and that may get used by Russian allies. So that will have even less of a connection to the US financial system and US detection methods. That any transactions done through the Russian SWIFT system would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to detect. So if that gets up and running, who knows? Now, Russia, that's not to say the Russian government will just stand by and allow for terrorist financing. I think the bigger concern with that is sanctions evasion. But at the same time, it could get misused. If you have the right official in the right place, they might let your transactions go. I know Russia has partnered, has been working with the Syrian government and the Iranian government and things like that. So, so that's a development definitely to keep an eye on. But in my opinion, the biggest development going forward will be online with cryptocurrency. So, what are some of the benefits of cryptocurrency? Things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, there's a million of them. It is mostly anonymous. I say mostly because when you actually look at cryptocurrency transactions, it will just show that it went from one wallet to another. So it's a series of characters, alphanumeric characters, from one series to another series of alphanumeric characters. But there are a lot of companies, most notably Chainalysis, that can find out who those people are, because every transaction, every cryptocurrency transaction done with the biggest cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, especially Bitcoin is the king, queen, president, prime minister of cryptocurrency right now. So it's definitely the most significant one, but also Litecoin, Ethereum, etc. Those are logged on the blockchain. So you can go to blockchain.com, look up a wallet, and you can see what transactions that wallet has partaken in. So with that centralized open source ledger, companies like that specialize in analyzing that stuff, like Chainalysis, and also the cryptocurrency trade, exchangers themselves, like Coinbase is the most notable, but Bittrex and all those, they keep pretty detailed customer due diligence records. And that's largely because when they were coming up, they wanted to be on the good side of the US government, because a lot of people didn't trust cryptocurrency. A lot of people still don't really know what it is, just think it's used for drugs and all that stuff. So they want to be on the good side of the US government. And to be honest, all the old people in Congress who don't know what it is, you just say, hey, look at all this due diligence we're doing. See, we keep very good records. So in partnership with the cryptocurrency traders and exchangers, plus the blockchain, plus companies like Chainalysis doing that, doing their analytical work, you can find out who a lot of these people are and where their money is going. So that's why I say mostly. It takes some work. It's anonymous on the surface, but with a little bit of work and going to the right places, you can figure out who those people are. And cryptocurrency can be used in darknet marketplaces. Regular fiat currency can't be used in darknet marketplaces. Darknet marketplaces are, auction houses or Amazon type vendors, but they're on the dark web, and they sell things like drugs and weapons and hitmen and malware and ransomware and virus software and things like that. And you can only use cryptocurrency to pay for that stuff. So if I'm a drug dealer, and before I had to go out to the purchaser's address and do a cash transaction for the drugs, that's adding a level of risk. I might get intercepted on my way there. I may get intercepted when I arrive at the purchaser's location. I may get intercepted on the way home. But this takes out all of those steps. because the payment is done online. So I only have to get the drugs to my purchaser. And a lot of times I'll use the mail or UPS or FedEx, or I may deliver them as well, but it takes out a level of risk. And it's also a lot of stuff that's hard to get. You can't just go to, Best Buy and ask for malware or ransomware software. You have to get it on a darknet marketplace. Also, cryptocurrency, unique to fiat, unlike fiat currency, can appreciate in value because it's a traded asset. So if you go look on the stock market, you can see what Bitcoin is trading at because it's considered an asset. It's a currency and an asset. So you'll see here at this chart, this is the value of cryptocurrency from 2010 to about last month. So if I'm a terrorist, say, and I acquired some Bitcoin in 2015, where it's trading at close to 1-to-1. So one Bitcoin is $1 roughly. And I held on to that asset and I sold it in 2018. In 2018, one Bitcoin was trading for close to $20,000, which is insane. Now it's been somewhat volatile. As you can see, it had a steep drop in 2019, but it's still pretty high. And right now it's trading at about 9,000. So at this time it was 8,800. It's gone up a little bit since then, but it's trading at that high of a level. You can make a lot of money without having to do anything. So you could just hang on to that asset and then trade it and make yourself a ton of money. And there's literally no risk. There's absolutely no risk to that. It's perfectly legal. And you can conduct some anonymous trades and peer-to-peer transfers, especially with cryptocurrency traders outside of the United States. I know a big one is Local Bitcoins. Local Bitcoins is headquartered in Finland. They will allow for anonymous peer-to-peer trading. They don't really have any customer due diligence. And a lot of times if money gets to Local Bitcoins, we don't know what happens to it. It's very hard to figure that out. And there's also, there's traders in other, exchanges in other parts of the world as well. I know Hong Kong has a fairly big exchange that once it gets to these exchanges, forget it. It's outside of our purview. And so in that sense, it's also easier to avoid contact with the regular financial system because this is a different financial system. There are more banks and financial institutions getting in on the Bitcoin cryptocurrency game. They're setting up partnerships with Coinbase and Bittrex and things like that, but they're taking a while. And so it's really outside the regular financial system, which is why a lot of groups like these far right groups really prefer it because it's not in the government backed financial system, and it's mostly anonymous. I mean, I think Richard Spencer tweeted that Bitcoin is the currency of the alt-right, which I'm sure Bitcoin was thrilled to hear that. But it allows them to avoid that contact with regular financial systems. So all those pitfalls I was talking about before, they're not really quite as subject to them. They're more subject than they think, but not as much as with regular banks and stuff. And also the government authorities are lagging behind in their understanding of cryptocurrency and in their ability to seize it, stop it, deal with it. The understanding, the perpetrators who are using cryptocurrency definitely understand it a lot better than the authorities trying to stop them from using cryptocurrency. And online scams, which generate a lot of Bitcoin, they're very cheap. I mean, you can send out 100,000 spam emails, the Nigerian prince emails or the extortion emails or things like that at no cost. I mean, or relatively little cost. And if you get 2 people to bite on that out of those 100,000 to send you 3,000 in Bitcoin, you've more than made your money. $3,000 in Bitcoin, not 3,000 Bitcoin. But you've more than made your money. But you can invest more and use ransomware, try to take over the software of some essential business. I know some hospitals and schools have been fallen victim to ransomware, and I think some have been forced to pay it so that they can get access to their systems back, especially these hospitals dealing with this influx of patients because of coronavirus. So who may use these digital currencies? Let me check on time. All right. So this is my last slide here. So who may use the digital currencies? Who's likely to embrace this type of technology? So first, it's groups with state backing, because, and the one that especially sticks out to me is Hezbollah. And Hezbollah hasn't really embraced cryptocurrency technology, somewhat surprisingly to me, because Iran has a fairly sophisticated hacking infrastructure, and they have acquired Bitcoin, they value Bitcoin, and so there's no reason to think that Iranian officials or quasi officials could train Hezbollah guys on how to use this technology. And so if you have that type of infrastructure, if you have a state infrastructure behind you, it's a lot easier to adapt and embrace and learn about this new technology than if you're just some dudes on your own hanging out, wanting to do terrorist stuff. So if you have that type of backing, it's a lot, that's huge. That's a huge infrastructure behind you and a huge, fountain of knowledge that you may be able to get to. Right-wing extremist groups have shown that they have embraced Bitcoin, will continue to embrace Bitcoin, and or other technologies. There's privacy coins like Monero that have very little customer due diligence at all, and are even more anonymous. There's also with cryptocurrencies generate there's more methods to launder your money, like mixers. So a mixer will basically take a amount, if you want to send 10 Bitcoin to someone, it will mix it up and break it up into a lot of small transactions, so it might not get detected. Or if you're sending to multiple people, it'll break that up for you. It'll ultimately get the funds to where you want to go, but it makes it a lot harder, and it'll mix up some of the code and makes it a lot harder to detect and trace. But we've seen right-wing extremist groups are, they're already embracing it, and so I don't see them stopping. Groups involved in the drug trade, like I said, with the darknet markets, much more efficient way to get money and gain a high value currency like Bitcoin that could accrue value, that could because it's such a volatile investment. And then groups and locations with little to no banking. Now mining Bitcoin, which is generating your own Bitcoin, that takes a lot of electricity. And so you need a really good power grid. You need really good computers to do that kind of stuff. So groups in remote locations, they're not going to be mining their own Bitcoin. But everything with Bitcoin, you can do it on your phone. You can have your exchange on your phone. You can have all sorts of traders on your phone. You can do all the business on your mobile phone. So if you're in some really remote location where you can't really get to a bank, that's okay. You can have someone send digital currency to your wallet, and you can acquire it on your phone in no time. And then you can use that digital currency on a darknet market. You can use it for legitimate stores. There are a lot of legitimate retailers who are starting to embrace cryptocurrency, and you can use Bitcoin at legitimate retailers. So, it gives access to funds for people who would have a hard time getting to the bank or getting involved in the banking system. And so finally, I think traditional groups, your Al-Qaeda types, they may be a little bit slow to embrace this. I think that has to do partially with their leadership being kind of old school, and not understanding really how any of this would work. And their methods have been somewhat working for them so far, especially your AQIM type groups. It's been working, so they're not going to stop it. They're not going to stop what's working. So they may be slow to adapt. We've seen, you see these established groups, really in any facet of life, any old established group is going to be slower to adapt to a new technology and embrace it. So they may be a little bit slow on the uptake. So, just, I guess, briefly to summarize, I'll take questions in a little bit, but, what the most important things, you really have to know your subject and who you're talking about and what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it. It's important for everybody. Everybody has to work together on this, be it financial institutions, governments, and businesses you might not think of, auction houses, retailers, museums, etc. And I think the future is online, like with everything else. The future is online with new types of currency. So I'll some time to take some questions. I can go a little over if you wish. I went about an hour, or I went a little longer than I planned, but I can stick around. Or if you have a question and want to get in touch with me, that's my personal email right down there. Just feel free to reach out. Just, if you wouldn't mind saying, hey, I went to your webinar, I have a question, so I know who you are. Or any other questions, feel free to shoot me an email, but I can take a few now if we wish.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rick. And that's great because we've got a ton of questions here. And I know we're a little bit past time as well. So if we don't get to your question here today, please take Rick up on his generous offer there to get in touch with him over email. But we'll try to get through as many of these as we can. But I did just want to make sure everyone is aware of time. We're just at about 11:34 now. So if you do need to hop off, please feel free to do so. We will also be making the recording of today's session available on the website by the end of the day today. So you can always check back in and access that at a later point. But all right, I will kick things off with some questions for you, Rick. So the first one here that we have is, could you please comment on how and why Russia would pay bounties for Taliban forces to attack US troops that they, the Taliban, are already after? So more broadly, this person says, have we seen bounties before as a practical tool for terror links between rogue states and violent non-state actors?
I mean, I haven't really seen it before, but that certainly doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I would think that the Russians may be using the bounties more. This may be some sort of separate groups that are separate from central Taliban leadership, because they have access to the territory, they know the territory, or people that maybe the Taliban, I mean, they're trying, I know the US and the Taliban have been trying to negotiate that peace deal, and with the Afghan government. And so the Taliban might be hesitant to conduct attacks. So this may give them some incentive to conduct those attacks and maybe start siding with Russia over the US. But in terms of bounties, I hadn't seen that before, especially from another state actor. But that certainly doesn't mean it hasn't happened before.
All right, so another question that we have in here is, what would you say to the idea that terrorism financing needs the opposite approach to organized crime finance and money laundering? When we look for money laundering, we look for illicit money entering the system. In terrorist funding, usually we see either legitimate funds that disappear for terror use or illicit funds that do not need to be laundered but transferred.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is partially accurate, but I think you also see a lot of illicit funds coming in. So it's in a way, I think terrorist financing is a more difficult thing to undertake than organized crime, because it's not so clearly illegal. But in terms of changing the approach, yeah, but that goes into also knowing your subject. So you have to have an idea if these seemingly legitimate transactions are not, or if these legitimate transactions need to be flagged and are noteworthy for one reason or another. So yeah, an organized crime approach exclusively is not going to work to stop terrorist financing. That you really have to be flexible. You have to know what you're dealing with and who you're dealing with, and it takes a multi-level approach, whereas organized crime doesn't require that quite so much, in my opinion. I don't know if that answers the question, but try.
All right, so another question. Given the overlap between organized crime and terrorism in regards to tactics and approach, in your personal opinion, should counter-threat financing efforts be merged with broader responsibilities to disruption organized financial crime, or should they be kept distinct? And what reasons would you provide for your opinion?
I mean, I would think that they should be merged, but I'm a big believer in communication across sectors. That, I think in an organization, any sort of organization, you really need to know what every sector is doing and what they're responsible for. At least have a general idea. So I think it would be good to merge them, because I think one big difference, the biggest difference, but besides illicit funds coming in to fund terrorist activity, is what those funds are used for. Organized criminal organizations are looking to make money, whereas terrorists are looking to use that money for a particular purpose. But I think, the more cross knowledge and cross pollination that you have in various organizations, I think certainly the better off you are, and the stronger your overall counter threat finance program can be, whether you're at a bank or a government institution. I think this idea of compartmentalization is a little outdated, and it leads things to not be as effective as they could be.
And one of our attendees actually seems like they had just a clarifying question for you with regards to the reporting forms that you were talking about, 8300, et cetera. Which institutions at home or abroad are required to report these?
So it's really any with a U.S. presence, a U.S. nexus. So if they have a branch here, they have to comply. So that's why Standard Chartered, Barclays, and China Construction Bank, and some of these, and Deutsche Bank, some of these international banks, they actually do have to comply because they have a presence here. So they fall under the Bank Secrecy Act, which is the legal, the law that requires them to do this reporting. So that's why it's very broad. The type of institutions that have to report is very broad, because if you want to do business here as a bank, you do have to report it.
And I think another clarifying question for you as well here. Will regulations come with social media companies and fraud/bad actors?
I would think so. But whether that would fall under banking, regulation and finance regulation, I don't think it would. I think that might be a little different. But yeah, I don't see. I would be surprised if there isn't some sort of regulation of these social media companies and the different bad actors that are on there and are using them. And where they can overlap is if you're using social media to solicit donations. But that's not necessarily a financial aspect, because that's the platform you're using to solicit the donation, but not the platform you're using to process the donation. So that probably wouldn't fall under the financial end. But again, but then again, Facebook is also trying to create their own digital currency. So there could be a lot of overlap there for sure. But I'd be surprised if there aren't some sort of regulations coming down on social media companies soon.
All right. So someone here who I think might have joined a little bit late was hoping that you might be able to discuss or touch on a little bit more any information that you have on the LTTE.
Is it LTTE, that Lashkar Taiba? I'm not sure.
Yes, that's the Tamil Tigers, the terrorist
the Tamil Tigers
in Sri Lanka.
Oh, right. Okay. I didn't touch on them. For the purposes of this presentation, I didn't really look into them too much, so I'm not sure what their particular funding streams are. I don't know too much about them. I'd be happy to look into them a little more. Or if you have some specific questions about what they might want to do, I could look into that. But off the top of my head, I can't really speak too much to their funding streams, just because I don't know too much about it.
All right, so one of our attendees is wondering, would a U.S. domestic terrorism statute be effective in tracking and preventing the funding tactics of lone wolf/white supremacist terrorists?
Could be. It depends what's in the statute, of course. But I think the key, one real key is enhancing, if that statute would enhance information sharing between financial institutions and government authorities. I think that is extremely important because, like I said, those financial institutions really are the frontline detectors. They see these transactions happening in pretty much in real time, and government authorities can't see that. So I think in terms of a statute, if that statute enhanced communication and cooperation and things like that even more than they are now, then yes, I think it could be effective. But that would largely depend on what a statute might say or do. But I also think, in terms of thinking about the terrorist financing framework, we need to generally, kind of take these lone wolves far right organizations with as much seriousness as we've taken the jihadi organizations. Because, like I said, our whole threat finance foundation and framework is based on international jihadi organizations. But are they necessarily the biggest threat at the moment? Probably not. I mean, if you look at the numbers, far right organizations domestic far right organizations far outweigh the jihadi organizations in terms of number of attacks on U.S. soil. So I think there needs to be a seriousness taken. We certainly need to continue taking the international jihadi organizations seriously, but I think there needs to be a level of similar seriousness for domestic far right organizations that hasn't been taken yet as well.
Great. I'm just scrolling up here. I had found our next question. Okay. So have you seen the emergence of any requirements in new trade deals with China or Russia and other countries, not the US, that require use of the Russia SWIFT, I hope I'm getting that acronym right, or
Yep.
some other mechanism of reporting financial transactions?
I haven't yet, but I haven't really read the any sort of trade deals in depth like that. I just know that that's an emerging technology and something to worry about. I'm not 100% sure if the Russian SWIFT system is completely operational yet. If it isn't quite yet, it will be soon. But as far as those trade deals requiring it or any sort, I haven't seen that. I don't think it's established enough yet. But there's just potential that it could be, and it's certainly a upcoming development that I think would definitely warrant some attention.
And a follow-up question actually from the same attendee. Cryptocurrency works well for financial transactions between buyers and sellers, but can you talk a bit about some of the limitations in translating Bitcoin into traditional cash that could be used to buy local goods, food, gas, etc.?
Some of the limitations in using transferring converting cryptocurrency to cash.
Yeah, it says, can you talk a bit about some of the limitations in translating Bitcoin into traditional cash? Yeah.
Well, so you have to, so you have to have a good, exchange. It depends on, your exchange and what they're capable of. And whether, you're a bank, a bank that you bank at may not want to deal with cryptocurrency companies at all. Some of them have been extremely hesitant to do so. So if you're trying to get funds from a cryptocurrency account into your checking account, that may, the bank may hold that up because they're just wary of cryptocurrency companies. This was especially the case, a few years ago, before banks really started embracing cryptocurrency at all. So, and before the exchanges were really trusted it was almost viewed like cryptocurrency is automatically sketchy, which it isn't necessarily. And so I think that could be it's certainly a big holdup. And it's, you know, taken the government a while to acknowledge cryptocurrency's practical utility, and that it isn't automatically sketchy. And if they're in another country, other countries and their banks may be very slow to adapt to crypto, you know, because they don't trust it, and they're going through some of those same, you know, trying to figure it out and realize that it can be okay, steps that the U.S. had to go through. So, you know, that exchange may be, you know, problematic, and yeah, and yes, and then finding someone, you know, willing to make a trade or deal with crypto, because it's not a huge portion of the market yet. It's still, you know, we're still, you know, banking and everything is predominantly in traditional currency and cash and means. So, you know, I guess finding someone who would be willing to deal in crypto, and then finding an institution or a reputable exchange or trader, you know, those could certainly be limitations into its practical use.
Great. Okay, so another question in here. Are there any chances you think of a reduction in money laundering through VAT fraud after Brexit?
I'm not sure. So I'm not sure where if the person who asked the questions in the UK or not. But we don't have value added tax. But a reduction, so fraud, VAT tax fraud. Can you just repeat the question again? I just want to make sure I get it.
Yeah, so, yep, exactly. So reduction in money laundering through VAT fraud after Brexit.
Yeah, I guess it's possible. I'm not familiar enough with some of the inner workings of Brexit to really speak too closely to that. But if VAT tax fraud, so, you know, if because after Brexit, if the VAT tax changes and the fraud isn't as prevalent, I wouldn't say there's a decrease in money laundering. I would say the people who are benefiting from VAT tax fraud would shift their methods. I think that's the more likely scenario. They would shift their methods and continue laundering money. I don't think, you know, there would be a reduction in money laundering just because one means of acquiring the fund disappeared. You know, I think they would just find a different means.
Great. And we've got someone in here who says that I share your perspective that cryptocurrency will be a more preferred funding option for terrorists in the future. And then they apologize if this was something that was already mentioned, and perhaps you wouldn't mind just reiterating. But would you have a breakdown or any ideas as to and examples of cash-funded terrorist activities versus those funded by cryptocurrency?
So, yeah, I mean, cash funded activities, you know, I guess, you know, those like the Hawala networks and different networks to get bulk cash into Iraq and Syria and other, you know, high level terrorist areas. You know, cash has been the preferred method for a long time. So, you know, pretty much any terrorist attack has been funded with maybe not necessarily cash in terms of wads of hundreds, but, you know, traditional financial means. And in terms of funding an attack through Bitcoin, I mean, an example doesn't pop off the top of my head at the moment, but I know that, you know, far right organizations have certainly been embracing it. If the person who asked the question, I would say, if you want to send me an email with your question, I can look into it a little more deeply and maybe give you a better breakdown than I could, you know, just right now off the top of my head. I could give you a much better answer if you maybe email me that question.
All right, and then one final question in here. How do West African countries like Nigeria with weak governance systems match up with evolving online infrastructure of terror financing, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's largely through mobile technology. So, you know, I mean, and Nigeria also has the unique aspect of being resource rich as well. So, you know, and Boko Haram would, you know, take advantage of the resources, though they're not in the oil region of the country. But I think the largest way is through mobile technology. So, you know, individuals in these countries can, you know, are connected to the internet and can receive and send digital currencies using their phone. You know, you don't need a real advanced, you know, electrical infrastructure or anything to be active in sending and receiving funds and participating in transactions and things like that. So, I think mobile technology has really changed the game for what people in these regions, you know, can do. And, you know, mobile technology, it's largely unregulated, and especially in countries with weak governance, it's going to be even less regulated. So, I think that, yeah, like I said, I think mobile technology has really just changed the game entirely, for especially for a lot of those parts of the world.
Well, thank you so much, Rick, for taking the time to speak with everyone today. I think that's all the questions that we've had come in. And thank you everyone for attending today. We really appreciate you joining. And again, we're gonna have this recording available on our website by the end of the day today. So if you missed anything or you wanna go back and hear on another part again, you can absolutely access that later. And as Rick mentioned, very generously, he's got his email listed there below. So if you do have follow-up questions for him, I definitely encourage you to reach out. But I think that's it for us today. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Stay safe.